So good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I know everyone's got a lot to talk about. But we might start with the program. This is why I didn't pursue a career as a school teacher. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Louisa Gibbs, and I'm the CEO of the Federation of Community Legal Centres. And the conversations that I've been part of this morning already have been just fantastic, and I'm so pleased that we're all here together today. We're going to start by recognising that we meet today on the unceded lands of Australia's First Nations people. And as we gather, we acknowledge that the wattle, the cockatoo and the bends in the river outside were taken without consent or negotiation. Today we meet on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and present, and we pledge ourselves to work alongside these First Peoples for a just future. And I extend this respect to any Aboriginal people who are in the room with us today. This was and always will be Aboriginal land, and we'd like to start by playing a video for you from the Jiri Jiri dancers. I'm so pleased that we're able to open with something to set the scene and make us think about where we're meeting this morning. And I'd like to now welcome Sarah Lefevre to the stand to introduce to you the event. And Sarah is one of our co-chairs of the Smart Justice for Women Coalition.
Thank you, Louisa. Good morning, all. To start, I too would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I would like to extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Smart Justice for Women recognises the specific barriers and systemic issues faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who come into contact with the criminal legal system and the continuing impact of racism and colonisation today. We recognise the leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in advocating for reform. We are committed to prioritising Aboriginal self-determination in deciding upon and implementing reforms that will impact their communities. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming here today. It's been fantastic to already be part of the fantastic conversations that have been started, and we're really keen for those conversations to continue. I'd like to thank you for coming along to the launch of the Smart Justice for Women's policy platform, ending the criminalisation of women in Victoria. My name is Sarah Lefevre, and I am a Senior Legal Policy Advisor at the Federation of Community Legal Centres and the co-chair of Smart Justice for Women. We extend our sincere thanks to Gaydens for their generous support of this event and this fantastic venue, and I hope you all enjoyed the morning tea. Gaydens acknowledges the importance of doing the right thing and making an impact by providing pro bono legal advice and support to disadvantaged and marginalised communities. Gaydens prioritises the provision of pro bono legal support to First Nations people, refugees and asylum seekers, and people experiencing mental ill health. Gaydens has several pro bono partnerships with many of our community legal centres across Australia. Thank you, Gaydens. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. There is still tea and coffee available, so please help yourself throughout the event. The restrooms are located outside and to the right towards reception. You would have seen them on your way in. This event is being live streamed and recorded. It will be available to view after the event. We also have a roaming photographer. If you don't wish to have your photo taken, please let someone at the registration table know, or our photographer, Katie. There are stickers at the table that you can put on your shirt if you don't wish your photo to be taken. Smart Justice for Women is a coalition of 42 members from the community legal sector, Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, the community services sector, academia and other organisations who are all committed to ending the criminalisation of women in Victoria. The coalition is coordinated by the Federation, the peak body for community legal centres in Victoria, and the Law and Advocacy Centre for Women, a specialist community legal centre providing legal advice, representation and wraparound support for women facing criminal charges. Over the last 12 months, Smart Justice for Women has been updating and developing version 2 of its existing policy platform. Version 2 is the culmination of extensive feedback from a broad range of stakeholders and members and includes relevant analysis and recommendations from recent reports, such as the Europe for Justice report, which we will hear more about today. I would especially like to thank Professor Eleanor Burke, AM, for joining us here today. We are excited to announce that a copy of the platform is now available online. You can access it through the QR code that'll be shown on screen and around the room. For those online, a link will be provided in the chat function. In terms of the order of events for today, after I provide you with an introduction to our policy platform, we will commence a panel discussion. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, and you're welcome to stay until midday for coffee and networking. We really encourage you to stay and continue the discussions that have started today. I would like to provide a content warning for family violence and sexual violence. Resources for further support are available on the screen, including Safe Steps, Sexual Assault Crisis, Lifeline, and 13 Yarn. For those online, the contact details will be in the chat. I would also like to acknowledge that we are still within the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, an annual international campaign that runs from the 25th of November to the 10th of December. The collaboration between Safe and Equal and Respect Victoria continued this year to support grassroots activities across the state during the campaign. We're very happy to be joined by Safe and Equal and Tanya Faha, who's here today. This year, Safe and Equal explored the theme to maintain a movement, we need hope, and asked colleagues from across the sector how they maintain hope in their work and activism. Content from these discussions will be up on Safe and Equal's website this week. Now to our platform. Smart Justice for Women takes an inclusive approach to the term women in recognition of the ongoing discrimination experienced by trans and gender diverse people in the criminal legal system. The number of women in Victorian prisons has more than doubled over the past decade, with the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women more than tripling. Yet women have specific and gendered pathways to criminalisation and imprisonment that are different to men. There is a clear link between disadvantage and women's involvement with the criminal legal system. Most women who are drawn in have experienced trauma, including childhood and adult victimisation, involvement with child protection, poverty, sexual abuse, and family violence. In fact, between 70 to 90% of women in prison have experienced violence and abuse. Women are also more likely than men to be criminalised due to issues associated with poverty and drug dependence. So without appropriate supports, these adverse experiences can drive women to engage in behaviours that lead them to becoming criminalised and imprisoned. Prisons are punitive, harmful, and expensive. They exacerbate trauma and replicate colonial systems of power and control. This environment is particularly damaging for women, and specifically First Nations women. Spending even short times in prison frequently interrupts important protective factors and opportunities for therapeutic intervention and recovery, and most devastatingly separates mothers from their children and families. Recognising that a different approach was needed, Smart Justice for Women was formed to reduce the criminalisation of women in Victoria. We advocate for approaches that impose the least restrictions on a woman's liberty when they are in contact with the criminal legal system. In light of recent findings and further analysis, which we will explore today, our 2023 to 2024 policy platform now has a more ambitious goal. We want to end the criminalisation of women in Victoria. With 39 member organisations, as well as leading academics, all working with, alongside, or adjacent to women who are being criminalised, Our coalition understands the unique needs of women who are being driven into the system. Our members have developed support programs, and we know what needs to change in the justice system. In particular, we would like to highlight the recent release of the Keeping Women Out of the Justice System report, presenting stories of success from 7 innovative projects delivered by our members and generously funded by the Victorian Legal Services Board and Commissioner, who have joined us here today. These projects have helped transform the lives of hundreds of women and offer proven solutions and alternatives to prison. Their collective impact points the way to better justice responses that can benefit the whole community. Drawing on the expertise of our members, our detailed policy platform identifies key reforms that we believe are required to end the criminalisation of women in Victoria. Today, we are incredibly privileged to be joined by an expert panel who will explore the broad and complex issues that criminalised and at-risk women face and identify ways to reduce harm through criminal legal reform and greater investment in trauma-informed and culturally safe services for women. I will now hand back over to Louise Gibbs, CEO of the Federation, to introduce our panellists and commence the panel discussion.
Okay. Fix that chair. There we go. Thanks so much, Sarah, for the overview of the policy platform. And I know most of you are a lot of people in the room have been involved in developing it, and others are also really deeply interested in reading it and seeing how it can support your advocacy and work as well. We're going to talk about some really pertinent issues now, and I've got the absolute privilege of welcoming our panellists today. So as I introduce them, they're going to come up and sit up here on the high stool so that you're able to see them a little bit better. So it's my real pleasure and honour to welcome Professor Eleanor Burke. Professor Burke is a Wiggera and Wemba Wemba elder and chair of the Europe Justice Commission. She's held executive positions in state and federal government agencies, including being the co-chair of Reconciliation Victoria and Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council board member and a board member of Native Title Services Victoria, where she participated in Victoria's first positive natal title determination. Professor Burke was awarded a Member of the Order of Australia in 2022. Thank you, Professor Burke. Next, I'd like to introduce Eleanor Pappas. Eleanor is the co-chair of Smart Justice for Women. She's also the co-founder and chief executive officer of the Law and Advocacy Centre for Women, a specialist community legal centre in Victoria that assists women who are in or at risk of entering the criminal legal system, providing legal advice and representation alongside wraparound case management and social work support. Ellie is also a board member of the Federation of Community Legal Centres, so I have to be on my best behaviour. Ellie, welcome, come up. I'd next like to introduce Leanne Morell. Leanne has a long history that is complex, convoluted and common across the many women who have experiences of incarceration. With fire in her eyes and a love for humanity, Leanne passionately advocates for systemic reform. Leanne started in Youth Parliament proposing youth justice reform. She's been a lived experience advocate with the Task Force Community Agency and a member of the Lived Experience Advisory Panel with the Collaborative Centre for Mental Health and Wellbeing. Leanne has been recently appointed to the Victim Survivors Advisory Council with Family Safety Victoria. Welcome, Leanne. Next, I'd like to introduce Nina. And Nina is a formerly incarcerated woman and an abolitionist. She is the Family Violence Justice Coordinator at Flat Out, a statewide advocacy and support service for women, transgender and diverse people and their children who've been criminalised, and a member of the Safe and Equal Expert Advisory Panel. Nina's a member of the Weavers Group, which is a group of women who have experienced domestic family violence and or sexual violence, who play a role in weaving lived experience into research and training at the University of Melbourne. Welcome, Nina. I'd now like to introduce Tanya Faha. Tanya is the Chief Executive Officer of Safe and Equal. Tanya has held executive positions across the Victorian Departments of Justice and Community Safety and Premier in Cabinet, including the role of CEO of the former Office of Prevention and Women's Equality. Tanya worked at UN Women for 4 years as a policy specialist in the Ending Violence Against Women section, and worked for Victoria Police for over 9 years to improve its responses to family violence, sexual assault and child abuse. Still a bit of work to go there, Tanya. Thank you, Tanya. And our final panellist today is Fiona Patton. Fiona is the leader of the Reason Party and was a member of the Victorian Parliament from 2014 to 2022. She was the first independent chair of the Parliamentary Legal and Social Issues Standing Committee and oversaw significant inquiries on the criminal justice system, homelessness, the use of cannabis, and the incarceration of and the impact of parental incarceration on children. And whilst in Parliament, Fiona initiated and delivered reforms including spent convictions, abortion law reform, the decriminalisation of sex work and drug law reform, a small portfolio of work. Since leaving Parliament, Fiona's continued to work on social reform issues, including the regulation of adult use of cannabis, drug harm reduction and greater separation of church and state. Welcome, Fiona. Now, along with the expertise that the panel will bring, I note that some of the panellists here have lived experience of incarceration. And Smart Justice for Women acknowledges that responses to criminalisation of women will be most effective and most safe for women if they are informed and developed in partnership with women who have lived and living experience of the criminal legal system. So in particular, I'd like to recognise that added element that our panellists bring today. Okay. Now, the criminalisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. This is part of an interconnected process of both individual and systemic racism, based on assumptions and judgments that reach far back into Victoria's past, colonial past, and they remain present today. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are being incarcerated at, what do you think, how much more than non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women? What kind of a difference? Anyone know? 22 times the rate of non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. Prison is not a safe place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, exacerbating historical trauma and undermining their cultural rights and the rights of their children. Professor Burke, we're very lucky to have you here today because you've looked at this in some detail through your work with the Yurok Commission and over the course of your life. I wondered if you could start by speaking to us a little bit about the key findings of the Yurok Commission and the Yurok Justice Report as they relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women interacting with the criminal legal system.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'm not very good with marks, so you'll have to keep an eye on it. It's on, is it? Yes. But I just want to say a couple of things before I respond. I want to thank you for the acknowledgement to country and the playing the Jira dancing clip. It's a wonderful start to every day if you see those dancers performing, and thank you. And I think it's really important to think about welcomes or acknowledgements at the moment, given that since what's happened since the referendum, there is a move to not have that happen. And I think people need to be more creative, talk as you did about an animal and bird, and people talk, we will often talk about our totems anyway, so it's really important that it's done in a way that is about place as well as people, I think, and perhaps a story, so I'd urge you to do that. In relation to your first question, that is a rather large sentence at the beginning, and it's got a number of things in it. You know,
We wanted you to explore it how you'd like to explore it.
Yes, and I think, I mean, it's tragic that, you know, we say that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are criminalised as part of a system. I mean, that is a tragedy to happen to our people. And you go on about the race-based assumptions, and this is the issue in my case. From the moment legislation was introduced, we lost control of our ability to be who we were, and that has continued to today. That just didn't happen. And I need to say to you, I'm sort of a strong person, but I have a love-hate relationship with the law, because it's been used to disempower us, to dislocate us, to say, to punish us. But we recognise that we have to use those mechanisms to make change. That's the sad truth. However, in everyday conversation, sitting in a room like this, having a conversation about a particular thing with anybody about an item on our agenda at the Commission, we can become quite emotional because we're sitting in a space drawing on the expertise that's come from across the waters to be the remedy for what was done in the beginning. And sometimes we get angry in a moment about something that becomes quite personal to us as an individual, whether it's about a person or a place, stolen child. We've seen in recent times in visits to prisons, you know, 3 young people in solitary confinement, not allowed to speak to each other and only being taken out for a few hours a day because of staff shortages. I mean, this is third world stuff, really, when you think about it. And of course, the other shocking thing was the prison that's not yet open, and the other place that's worth so much money, and is being maintained so it doesn't become. I mean, these are the things that are incomprehensible to us when we're, you know, dealing with day-to-day things. But in terms of trauma, the other aspect, of course, was the legislation that for over 100 years we had so-called protection legislation. And it was all about stopping us being who we were, stopping us to speak our languages, stopping us practicing our cultures, separating us so that we couldn't do the things that we did before. And that trauma and hurt is still with us because we have remnants of this information. We have remnants of language and so on. We have to make big efforts to do recovery, and of course it's all piecemeal, and we have to go to, like everybody has to in the world, and seek funds to do this, whether it's a mini project in the school about language, or it's a project like our huge project with the Uruk Justice Commission. But I need to say to you, this is for us an historic moment, because it is happening here in Victoria. And thank God that the timing just is okay for us. But we didn't just get here by, you know, a few meetings. This has taken at least 25 years, 50 years in terms of our fight for land rights, as it was. And And I must acknowledge that we have always had many supporters in the space that we have walked in. Many other Australians and Victorians have walked with us at different times. But it is very hard for us to see the journey sometimes because it's so slow. But Yuruk is unique in that it is a royal commission. It is a royal commission. It is historic in this country, and it is very important. So the recommendations that we make, we'll be looking to groups like yours to advocate support for the implementation, because that's the other side of it.
I think we can probably provide that support.
The other part of it is that it's so slow for government to respond for various reasons. It's so slow because they are responsible for many sides of the consideration, but they're too slow in our space, just too slow altogether. And we are kept very busy, of course, doing things with and for government. And sometimes the main things get lost. So the Yuruk Justice Commission is very concerned about implementation of the recommendations we are making. And they come from the voices of our people directly, but they also come from advocacy from groups like those who are in the room and who you represent. And it's really important that that continues, because we don't do that as well. We don't have the numbers. There's just a small percentage of the population. It is extremely hard to be heard sometimes, because this is a blanket annihilation in many ways of all of the things that we were. Now, we haven't so we haven't lost everything, because we do have our memory. We do have our families that generationally, we do have stories. The story is shifted, of course, and we tell them usually in English, but still, no names of things. It's broken. But in terms of the time frame, I come from a family where, if I go back to my great-grandparents, one lot were born in the 1840s and another lot in the 1850s. And that is a time frame for me that is short, really. I never knew those people, but I know of them because my grandparents talked to me about, my mother talked to me about them, and we have many families that have that. Also, though, we have many families who, since what has happened with colonisation and interference in our life, who don't have that longevity either, shorter lifespans, more trauma, more interaction with law and all of the things that come out of that, and the reasons that they have those interactions are destructive to our people. So I'm, I hate the terminology, criminalisation, as though it's a sickness that's just happened. It's a process that's been done over such a long time. And so I just really want people to understand that and keep informing yourselves about those things. And as I said, my thing about the law, I expect the law to help us, not to hinder us and hold us back.
And Professor Burke, recognising you have allies in the room, from what you've been hearing at the Commission, are there any particular findings in that space about incarceration of women, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, that we should be reflecting on and thinking about in our work?
Well, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so I need to
that's a
tell you.
but there's enough of them in the room.
But I think we don't haven't thought like that actually,
Yeah.
the distinction.
Yeah.
It's about the children, the family, the fathers. And I have to say, I went to one women's prisoners and I went to two others where males, very young, three young people, the ones that I've just described about isolation. And I was terribly moved by their situation because that was a horrible thing to see three young people being treated the way they were and for no good reason, really, to be in isolation, but weren't enough staff. Another place I went was a bigger group of men, quite a large group where they use art as recreation. But those people struck me, the spokespeople out of that group struck me again in a different way. And they were worried about going to a prison where they could do a course so that they could get out, so they could have their family back. So, this whole thing is just a vicious circle. And some people, they just lose their way. So just to say again that women get criminalised, this is all about the despair, the loss of purpose, being locked up in a closed space. I mean, it's very hard culturally to talk about it, really, and that's what I meant earlier about, you go from open space to a locked up space. I mean, that's the criminality of it. That is the thing, about it.
That's the crime.
That's right. So I've gone on a bit about that, and of course, systemic racism is another thing that permeates our society against us. But maybe I've taken enough time in that.
Not at all. I think they're really important reflections for us, and I want to thank you for sharing from your unique position with all of us. We're all learning in this space as well, so thank you. Building on that, Ellie, you do work in that space. I'm interested of the legal representation and providing not just legal responses, but the casework responses around it. And I'm wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit about how those interactions with the criminal legal system from your perspective, building on what Professor Burke had to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's hard to follow that because obviously I think, our role is to make sure that we're elevating the voices of the people who are affected in this space. So my perspective is very much just as a practitioner who's worked alongside people who are really impacted by racism, systemic racism, and a colonial process that continues to criminalise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But I would just, I think, reiterate the commitment of everyone in this room to make sure that we work towards implementing recommendations from UROC in every aspect of our own practice. I think we can't wait for government. We can't rely on government because, as Professor Burke has said, it's a slow process and it's going to take them a long time to sift through things and work out what legislation they might want to change and what is going to serve their political interests. And we can't rely on government to implement these changes. So I think all of us as practitioners in this space, as lawyers, as social workers, as policy advocates, we need to know these recommendations and we need to practice them every day in our own advocacy. We need to create the alternatives ourselves. And I think it's really important that as a coalition, we come together to do that. Yes, it requires resourcing, but we can do that. We can find the resources and we can't rely on government. We know that. So I think that if we can live and breathe this in our own work every day, then that's the way we can speak truth to power and support all of the incredible work that the Europe Justice Commission has done and really support the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that we're working with.
Thanks, Ellie. That's fantastic. I might get you past the microphone over to Leanne. I think there's some really important reflections from both Professor Burke and Ellie about what space we need to be listening to, the experiences we need to be listening to, and the privilege we have with there being a current commission that's helping us to understand. And then thinking about what our role is going forward and recognising that collectively as a coalition we have a space to discuss and amplify those messages that are coming through from the commission. So thank you both. Speaking about the Coalition's policy platform, and Sarah's outlined the highlights of it, and you can, in your own time, read it in depth. But the policy platform, the reforms that we suggest in the policy platform are grounded in research and evidence that have been collated over a number of years, and they're relating to women's trajectories towards criminalisation and women's interactions with the criminal legal system. And what the research is telling us is that women who end up in prison have higher rates than men of mental ill health, substance use and homelessness. Yet many women haven't had access to the supports and services that would address those issues before they have contact with the criminal legal system. And we also know the vast majority of women in prison have experienced family violence. So when we take those issues into account about the ways that women, the experiences of women at the point in time that they do enter the criminal legal system, let's stop and think a little bit about how we better support women early. How do we support them early to end that cycle of criminalisation before it begins? And Leanne, I know you've got some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I certainly do. Many thoughts. I guess I might kind of start on a little bit of context. So this trajectory into prison, like starting from mental health, and it just kind of, it goes down from there because it's left untreated. There's no one there to support. And that was exactly my experience. So I experienced like childhood trauma, and that tends to lead to some pretty serious mental health problems. And, you know, it stunts development. It's got all of these issues that can come from that. And it's just kind of luck of the draw, which one of them you get. And you kind of go through life, especially through adolescence. You know, once you hit that adolescence, like that 12, 13 age, that's when mental illness really starts to show as well. So you're going through school, if you've got unsupportive family or you just got a lack of support, you're in out-of-home care, and it just kind of festers. And you go through life and it festers and it keeps going, and people don't seem to catch it. In my experience, I reached out to school supports and it was not positive. It always ended up negative. So it pushed me further away from wanting to seek support. And similar to what was said before around, you know, isolating someone, that's also a thing, like mentally and socially, when you feel like you're the black sheep and you won't want to connect. So then that continues to fester. Then you become an adult. And I mean, I'd like to think it was common sense in this room, like what happens after that? When people mentally, they get desperate, they don't know what to do. So they're just constantly trying to fix a problem that they don't even know what it is. So that early intervention is so critical, but it's like, well, how do you even start that? Because most people don't recognize, well, probably the people in this room, but most of the general population don't really understand the causes behind a lot of these problems that we're seeing in society, behind criminalisation. I know that I've recently entered a space and everyone's like, yeah, we want to do this, we want to take these actions, but you're treating symptoms, you're not treating the cause. And it is this constant problem of everywhere I look in all of these spaces, and I'm trying really hard to find these spaces to help influence reform, but a lot of them are only seeing the symptoms and not treating the cause. I mean, if you go to a doctor and you just keep treating these symptoms, but you never find the cause, the problems won't ever stop. So a big part of this would be educating the general public. Like somehow we have to figure out this way to make it click. And until these ideas and understandings of the underlying causes, until that clicks, we're going to struggle to see any real sustainable change. So I think that stigma also comes from that, because they don't understand. They actually don't understand. You know, and I love to, when I meet new people, I love to show them all the good things, and I'll just drop, oh yeah, and I was also in prison. And it shocks them. And they're like, you can see them, they kind of like, they're buffering, right? And they're like, and I like that shock factor, because that's how you break the stigma. And I say, well, I do this and this and that. And they go, oh, wow, you do all this stuff. And then I say prison. And they're like, what? Because how else do you really break that stigma that, well, you don't really know the context, you don't really know the story. And it's also got this notion of, when society looks at younger people and they go, oh, they're troubled, they're doing all these bad things because they weren't supported, because someone failed them. But those adolescents are still unsupported. What happens when they become adults? Why do we change our view? That's something that I will never be able to wrap my head around, because why is it, one rule for me, another for thee, or whatever? That is a problem. You can see these young people, but until there's some intervention, there's some support, nothing's going to change. The only thing is they get older, they age out of systems, they age out of free support. Well, now they're having children. They don't know how to support themselves. How are they supposed to support their families? And that's where that stability, to be able to create stability for women and their children, is so important. So housing is like the big one, but that's a problem for everyone at the moment anyway, so that's not a secret. But but the flexibility of social housing. When I had a transitional house, I was just out of prison, and when I got my daughter back, they said, oh, but you applied for it when she wasn't in your care, you can't have her there. I was like, but just kind of breathe deeply. Anyway, so housing that's safe is really integral to providing that stability, but that stability is only step one. That's only beginning to build that stable foundation. So you also need, and this is obviously never a one-size-fits-all approach because everyone's situation is different. So you need to pay attention to what supports do they need. And they will probably need intensive support, because the theory is if you can do that intensive support, yes, it's going to take a lot of resources, but it's going to be go hard right now. And that support will build that stable foundation, because without a stable foundation, everything will crumble. It's just a matter of when. And you just need those supports to scaffold the woman or the family. And then that will be sustainable change. That's going to go down through generations. If you keep giving Band-Aid fixes, it's going to look good for a couple of years, and it's just a matter of when will it fall apart. And then that's going to cause more intergenerational trauma. The public isn't ready to hear that yet.
That's fantastic, Leanne. And I think I would like to say thank you for sharing those personal experiences. And I can't begin to imagine that feeling when you had that response about the housing with your daughter on your hip.
Yeah, it's frustrating, but what can you do? Just got to try your best, hold it together. But it brings a whole nother set of issues. It's well, when I came out and I had my daughter in my care, and it's well, I don't even know who this kid is. I've spent amount of time away from her. Kids develop so quickly. It's how am I supposed to figure out how to parent again? And now I've lost my stability of housing and have to go back into the place that traumatized me in the first place. And it's well, there's a million different things to work through, and it's still really difficult. But I've aged out of a lot of supports because years have gone by. And then you've got the whole, well, there's a housing crisis. I try not to scream every night. But a lot of my theory is that if you take that stupid amount of money that's put into prisons and keeping people in prisons, and you divert put that justice reinvestment into those support services, you're going to stop people in the future needing to cost the system money, having them in the system, having them criminalized. You'd rather them in their own homes, stable, contributing to society, paying your taxes, raising kids well, than being a burden on the tax system.
I'd like to see that.
And I think about it a lot, because isn't that how you ultimately create a better, more ideal society? If you support all of these people and you just go hard, support them really, really well at the start, they're going to find their feet. They will then be able to support their family, their children, their future generations. It's flow-on effects. It's domino effect.
Leanne, thank you. One element that I think is important to discuss is that intersection with the family violence and what that means for women who go into prisons. I wondered whether you had any reflections on that, and I might also ask Tanya to speak about that as well.
Yeah, so that intersection with family violence, it's really complex. So when I was in, I obviously had never been in before, and I found my little group of friends. And it didn't take me long to realize that all of us had experienced family violence. I was shocked. We all had very apparent mental health issues. We'd all had substance use issues. We all had kids that were taken away from us. It was mind blowing. I couldn't believe it. And it's that intersectionality. It's like ingrained. I'm actually surprised the statistics of women in prison isn't higher for experiencing family violence, because when you look, or when you're in there and you like when you talk to other people, I mean, I don't know if I'm hypersensitive, but it's apparent. It feels like it's so shockingly obvious. And you've got that gender inequality as well, where women are held to different expectations than men. And that is a massive factor in the way that we perceive. I even also think like family violence, perceptions. And a lot of the time we think of family and domestic violence, and we focus a lot on intimate partner relationships, but we don't put enough focus on like the childhood trauma that can be caused by parents as well. And as you know, Fiona's inquiry, like the effects of children that have had parents that are incarcerated, like it's pretty effed up, and it is so significant. And I think that's also where you need to stop it before it starts. Like you got to stop that cycle. Intimate partner relationships, it's kind of harder to stop that cycle because it's not necessarily as generational. But I think it's a lot of swept under the rug. A lot of people can't also recognize that they've experienced violence because of cultural reasons, or just maybe they're even in denial. They probably don't even remember. Like I've got pretty much fuck all memories of my childhood. And it's only now that I'm raising my child that I've actually realized, oh my God, why don't I remember all this stuff? So how many other people are there out there like me? And I know there's a lot. So then you've got the other issue and those barriers of, well, I've got a history. If I wanted to go to a service for support, they'd be able to see that history. Information sharing schemes, and it makes me really reluctant. And I don't think, even if I really, really needed it, that I would ever go to a service, because I would be at risk of losing my daughter again. I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. She's older now. She'll remember. And even just trying to heal that that hidden memory of hers, of me not being there, is still really hard. So how do we, like, I've noticed that services are made for your average people, which is great because it services most, but then you're actually leaving behind your most vulnerable and most marginalized. And those most vulnerable and most marginalized are going to have kids, probably even at a higher rate, or, you know, for whatever reason. If we don't start targeting, or at least observing, how to make services accessible and safe for our most marginalized and vulnerable populations, things are only going to get worse. They're going to continue to fester. We're going to go really downhill. Like, we so desperately need that justice reinvestment to get that sustainable change. And, you know, it will be slow, probably not as slow as typically government will move, but it needs to be built on a stable foundation. Like, going back to, if you don't build on a stable foundation, nothing is going to last. It might look great for the short term, but it will always crumble.
Thanks, Leanne. Great insight. Tanya, I'm just going to pick up on some of those elements of family violence, because I do think that's important. And I loved your phrase, Leanne, about we're just treating the symptoms and not the cause. So what are some of those things we can do to be supporting those things in the family violence space, do you think, in the intersection?
Oh, firstly, can I just add to acknowledgement of country, and I always like to do that because it reminds me that we are here on unceded lands. So just to acknowledge and thank you, Professor Burke, for sharing that. I just also want to thank Leanne and Nina, very brave to come up here and always talk about your own experiences. I've had a lot of experience with Nina, and they always hold me to account constantly. So I'm used, but I do think it's not easy to do that. You know, I've been lots of panels with people with lived experience, and I'm always amazed by the bravery. So good to be here. I don't know what more to add other than to say I think we're always generous on the research, you know, 70 to 90% of it. I'm pretty sure it's 99.999 reoccurring. And that's for family violence and or sexual assault. So, you know, just remembering that as well. And as well as that experience, there's also the drivers that led to the experience, but then the intersecting forms of oppression that are ongoing that people are experiencing, which is why Aboriginal women from non-English speaking, we're seeing more and more women from non-English speaking backgrounds in prison now too. So, you know, it's very interesting, you know, these multiple intersections, you know, and it seems a bit like a vicious circle sometimes, you know, what drives what and how do people get out. And I think that's the point you were trying to make, Leanne. I could really, you know, identify with that. And I was like, I think, you know, the other thing we also have to think about is some of these deliberate, you know, we always think about substance abuse for people who've experienced violence or family violence and some of those things that may end up leading to criminalisation. There's also the coercion that comes from people, from perpetrators around the use of some of those things too. And I think we're getting better at understanding those manipulative tactics and things. And so that's one of the things the system can do, I think, is start to identify early what is happening in these relationships. And I agree it's not all about intimate partner, but within, you know, families, trying to identify early. You know, we talk a lot about understanding and individual responses for children and young people, just trying to pull out exactly what is happening for every person in the family and how do we address that. You know, I think that's a really important thing. I think absolutely we need to divert, you know, particularly women and young people out of the prison criminalisation system. But to do that, we do need resources, and we do need resources for services that not only are family violence services, but those other needs related services. And, you know, it's funny, we were just having this debate, and I always think, can every mainstream service, so I work in the specialist family violence sector. Now that's specialist to some degree, but there are mainstream specialist family violence sector there. But can they ever respond to everybody's needs, particularly some of the complexities that people face? And probably not. We probably still need targeted services within specialised services to be able to respond and understand some of those. You know, Leanne, sorry, you spoke about, you know, understanding your situation, and can someone who in a mainstream situation who may have never experienced or but has the knowledge to learn, you know, maybe you do need something extra there helping to inform the system, you know. And I think, you know, we've done a lot of work, I think, as a system. We try to develop, you know, really complicated and complex tools around risk assessment. And I think to some degree, they're great, and they're really pushing the service to better understand what is happening for people there. But they can also be limiting too, because, you know, you need to look out of tools and resources a little bit and see the individual circumstances. So I think we still need to keep an eye on that broader professional judgment and help people have the confidence they need to make those professional judgments for addressing people's needs. So I guess there's some of the things, you know, we're thinking about in the family violence sector now. But of course, the family violence sector can only do so much. because of the other systemic issues and barriers that are faced, and housing is critical. I mean, nobody can recover without a stable home. And without a stable home, you end up homeless and then so much more susceptible to some of these issues or drivers that we're saying. So this circle of, you know, just, not having what you need to be able to live your life and live your full potential is a systemic and structural issue that we as a society really need to address.
Thanks,
And
Anthea.
I'm not sure how we're going to manage that moving forward, but we absolutely need to be brave and continue to try. So
I think we're behind you, very united. Thanks, Tanya. I think maybe pass the microphone to Nina, because I think some of those systemic issues I think we can pick up on, and one of those is those interactions with police, isn't it? And and how that can lead to women being incarcerated. And Nina, I think you might have some insights on this, because what we know is there's ongoing misidentification of victim survivors of family violence as being the predominant aggressor in a family violence situation by police. A small study conducted by Women's Legal Service Victoria in 2018 of 35 women showed 35 female clients named by police as respondents to family violence intervention orders. It resulted in 32 were being incorrectly identified. So that's about 60% being incorrectly identified. And these practices also, again, disproportionately impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and lead to the criminalisation of victim survivors, compounding their distress and trauma. So to address mis-ID, by police, a focus on radically targeted policing and discriminatory policing practices really needs to take place. And I've heard that from you, Nina. What reforms do you think need to be implemented sort of through Victoria Police to prevent them misidentifying women and that pathway into incarceration?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, I would like to also acknowledge that we're on the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation people, and that sovereignty was never ceded and we are on stolen land. I think Eleanor and Ellie have already said that we cannot rely on government to solve any of these issues, and just wanted to again say, out of 55 people that represented, 32 were incorrectly identified, and those numbers are just absolutely phenomenal. And, you know, it leads me to think in a society that operates under white supremacy and patriarchal ideas, that these systems are strongly weaponised against folks. And I think too that, I don't know, sometimes I think that Royal Commissions have to answer for this. I think, you know, pre-Royal Commission, I was hearing a lot of language around self-defence. I'd no longer even hear that word being mentioned. We call it mis-ID. It is self-defence. And I think about, you know, when is that language used? And I think, okay, the only time that I ever hear that language being used is when an officer pulls out their gun and shoots someone. And that's the only time I hear that self-defence is being used. And I feel like, you know, it takes back to that outcry of community to defund the police, and particularly as first respondents. Like, you know, those numbers alone are saying that they are not getting it right, that they are causing so much harm, and we hear so many horror stories across our communities. I'm engaged with so many victim survivors, whether they be from LGBTIQ communities, coal communities, First Nations, young people, old people, people with a disability, criminalised folks, people that use drugs. All of them are saying that police are getting it wrong, that police are harming us, police are not safe, police should not be the first respondents to family violence incidences or any incidences across the board. And I know I'm going to go a bit off track, but this morning I drove past I drove from Phillip Island, and I was constantly hearing on the radio, oh, Climate Action are going to be, you know, doing their thing in the streets this morning, and, you know, you might expect delays in traffic. And I actually drove through. There was about 15 people standing there with a banner, and I shit you not, about 40 cop cars and 40 cops standing there, and they were the ones that were obscuring traffic. They were the ones that were, and I was like, seriously, like, where are you? Right. And all of them have got these signs on their cars saying, you know, burnout, and I was like, oh wow, like, honestly, please quit. Like, you'd be doing us all a favour. Nina's solution is to ask all police to quit. Let's look into that. I think too. I think too that talking about mis-ID, I was misidentified in my early teens, and was colluded to go for a diversion, which was portrayed to me as a really easy fix. You'll have the court hearing out of the way, you plead guilty, you'll walk away, everything will be fine. And I believe this narrative had no reason why to question it. Went through, did my children's services, and had to get a police check in order to do my placement. It wasn't until then that I realised that it's on my record, and has been, and provided all sorts of complications throughout my life, having that label attached to me. And I think too that I really struggle with the terms perpetrator, victim. I mean, there's absolutely no excuse for the harm that was used against me by the father of my child. But also I know that if you spoke to him, he would swear black and blue that I was the perpetrator, because the narratives and the white supremacy and the patriarchal ideas that he grew up in his family, his dad was a biker, had him believe that I was not tame. I was not complying to his ideas of how he grew up, and generational sort of ideas and gender norms of how I should be behaving as a woman. So, if he disappeared in my car for days on end and I was to question that, that would not be okay for him. And that's because he watched how his parents had their dynamic. So I think that and I had 6 years of IVOs, child protection, 78 breaches, all sorts of things going on, family court, children's court. And my child is now growing up without a father because there was no opportunities for him to have recovery, healing, awareness around his behaviour. I obviously tried to the best of my ability, that's why it was a 6-year process, to try and have a level of understanding, and a lot of us, we love the people that are using harm against us. It's really, really challenging to only be able to rely on a legal system to sort of address these harms and address these therapeutic, transformative. I just think that there's so many benefits in being able to do this without the legal justice system. And I think too, it leads me to think that this idea of policing and this idea of the carceral creep and how it comes further and further into our communities, comes further into our social workers. I know too that I've got to address the internal cop in my own head. I still, when my child misbehaves, I'll be like, you're naughty, you're bad, let's punish you. And that's sort of really, really trying to sit down with him and being like, look, this is how I'm struggling, this is how I'm feeling, this is what you're making me feel, how are you feeling about it? And really having those opportunities to have that open dialogue. But I don't think that, in our colonial capitalism, fast-paced society, do we have the time and ability to be able to sit down and have these open dialogues and have these conversations. And I think that, it's been said before, we have the power. We are the people, and we have the opportunities to push back against this. I definitely don't think to answer the question, I know I've gone a bit of a rant, but to answer the question, we absolutely do not need any more police reforms. We do not need any more money put into policing. It is not working. We all know that. And I think too that it's for criminalised survivors, and there is just so much framing, and I think just across the board in our society, against what is a risk and what isn't a risk, and what is seen as dangerous and what's not dangerous. And I feel particularly with mis-ID, we are missing the point of crisis, survival and resilience. We are pushing back in moments of crisis, in moments of survival. We're acting in a resilient way, and that needs to be seen and addressed. And I don't think it's by educating police. I don't think it's by educating magistrates. I think maybe a solution for me would be that there is a specialised team that does address these things, where people who have been misidentified can go to get legal support that doesn't collude you to do a diversion, that doesn't, that really takes the time and the effort to fight. And I know that it's really, really challenging. Like, I had to do self-representation through court because I was a homeowner at the time, and I was also a single parent pensioner, so I wasn't eligible for legal aid, but also couldn't afford a lawyer, so I had to do like all of this self-representation. And I know too that like there's a real value in being at the forefront of those court hearings and being able to engage with like the children's lawyer and the person that was using violence against me, their lawyer, and have these open conversations. And it takes time, and like the fight is real, it is exhausting, and to have people in your corner that you can go to be able to address misidentification would be huge. Also, I want to say, Smart Justice for Women, huge coalition. Like, we do have the power to really make some changes. We just need to stand together, stop doing work on our own. Like, I know that there's great work being done across the board, but I feel like we're really, really siloed in our approach. And the more that we work together and the more that we work collaboratively, the bigger the chances are that we can create change.
Wonderful, Nina. That's really fantastic, Nina. And look, I think there's certainly support for that coalition building because of the power that we have when we speak jointly on these issues as well. Nina, some fantastic points there. And I think thinking about the mis-ID and thinking about that both you and Leanne have spoken about being mothers, I'm going to switch it up a little bit now and maybe pass the mic to Fiona, who led the parliamentary inquiry into the children of incarcerated parents. And I would actually just like to acknowledge Rod Barton, who's in the room as well, who was on that parliamentary committee as well. Thank you, Rod, for your work on that as well. But it is important to register that the majority of women who are in Australian prisons, the majority, are parents, and that children whose mothers are in prison are more likely to have a disrupted education, poor health and unstable housing, all of which are factors that heighten the risk of a child or young person entering the child protection system or coming into contact with the criminal legal system, which is the point you made exactly, Leanne, isn't it? Now, this is particularly concerning given that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are the most vulnerable and overrepresented cohort within the child protection system. Separating Aboriginal children from their mothers or carers disrupts their connection with culture, land, family, and perpetuates the impacts of historical trauma. So I'm going to ask maybe Fiona to speak a little bit to how we prevent mothers ending up in prison in the first place. And then Professor Burke, I might pass to you as well, because we want to understand how do we prevent them from coming in and what can we do to better to support them. Particularly, we'll come to you, Professor Burke, on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents keeping that connection with their children. Fiona?
Thank you. And thank you for just such a terrific panel so far. I think I'm going to have a sore neck from nodding quite so much. And also I think Professor Burke's comments around that acknowledgement of country and the bizarre moment that we are in time where we're starting to say that that's not necessary. Of course it's necessary. We know the impact of colonisation and the impact that that has had on the conversations that we're having today. And it is because of that unceded land and the fact that we must continue to recognise the impact of what has occurred over the last 200 plus years in this country. The answers are almost quite simple. Stop jailing mothers and put money into housing.
What do we think?
And it was interesting in our time when I was on chairing the Legal and Social Issues Committee. One of the first inquiries that we did was homelessness, and so we recognised the impact of homelessness that had on women, in particular, escaping family violence or from histories of family trauma. that would end, that would create this direct route into the justice system. Then we looked at the use of cannabis. We looked at, and I shout out to the Member of Parliament, Rachel Payne, who's here from the Legalised Cannabis Party. But we saw the impact of drug use, and particularly on women as another direct conduit into the justice system rather than into the health system, which is where they were where their support could have been. So starting with not jailing women, not jailing mothers, but measuring. We don't actually measure. We don't ask someone if they are a parent. It comes out, but we don't measure it. So we're not actually setting up systems. So if parents are incarcerated, that their children are at the centre, that we can have a line of sight. You know, we were hearing stories where, you know, a mother would go in for a parole check, be arrested, and her children were left in the car park at the police station. You know, there was just this lack of care. Now, so we saw lots of ways to reduce this, but really also when we're looking at bail reform, and we've made some progress this year, which has been terrific. But again, putting children at the centre, and so you know the idea of jailing a mother who is pregnant, the idea of jailing someone who is breastfeeding, surely we can find better ideas for that. And again, it goes back to housing. Again, it goes back to the supports that you were talking about. But we need to measure it. We also need to possibly have someone who does have sight of those children. And right now, no one does. It's not the police. It's not corrections. It's not the courts. There's not the Department of Family. There is no one who has specific responsibility. Now, of course, we don't want to be jailing women, and we don't want to be jailing mothers or parents. We need to look at alternatives to doing that. And I just think in that, we know the answers. We've known them for 25 years, for 30 years. They've been there. But governments haven't been brought to account to respond to that. You know, whether it's just not responding to the criminal justice inquiry or the incarceration or the response that they gave to the impact of children from parental incarceration. The 2-page press release that responded to the 30 odd recommendations from that was appalling. I sadly read it this morning, which just was not a great start to my day. But we know the answers. We don't, and governments need to be brought into account. And I think with Professor Burke's opening comments around how we're going to ensure that the recommendations from Europe are responded to and acted on in a timely measure, in a timely way, when we know that they haven't responded to so many other recommendations. And I think, you know, there's measures, we talk about integrity in government, and I think things like not responding to parliamentary reports, not responding in a timely way to royal commissions or URUC is actually something really important. It's something that every organisation in this room should be starting to raise and bring them to account. Now, obviously, we present to Parliament, we present to members of Parliament, we present to governments ideas, policy, research that shows better ways and ways we can improve the lives of people largely of disadvantage, but actually challenging them to be accountable. And I think there's measures that we need to do, and it'll be around better integrity, better transparency in government.
Oh, thanks, Fiona. Yes. We'll pass it back down here. Lack of care, Auntie Eleanor, what do you think? Lack of care. Would you like to speak a little bit about that, the issues of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
My head's full of a few things that have been said already that are touch points for us, and I'd like to acknowledge that, especially your comment about housing and a person you were talking about or yourself being in a different place from when you, I mean, those things sound like nonsense, don't they, really, when you hear them? But that is bureaucracy gone mad, really, and it shouldn't happen. But there are many things in the housing and homelessness space that are similar. The one thing that is very hard for our situation is where a mother has been in the system for whatever reason, and she may be pregnant and birth happens in the prison. That child is taken away in the prison and you can understand what that does. And that happens so often in our situation because the state had this concept of protection of us and our people. And that has one difference, and I didn't hear anyone talk about grandmothers, but that brings into play the grandmothers having to take a role. It brings into play the problem of lack of housing. It brings into play communications with family, like the grandmother, if you're, in that situation. All of those things all are just destructive to family life, to ability to continue in a normal way. So I just make those as comments. And the other thing I would say about my comments about legislation is in some places you only have to have a surname that is known locally to the police and you are disadvantaged immediately. And that sort of sounds a bit loose, but one piece of legislation that was drafted in Tasmania when there was a lot of Aboriginal people remaining did actually include Aboriginal family names in that legislation. So you had 12 to 14 people who were identified in this piece of legislation as being Aboriginal families. And forever after, and Tasmanian people aren't as dark as what we are. I don't know if they don't get the same. They are fairer in the main. And it's a shocking thing to think by surname you get treated differently. And it happened. And I saw it in Tasmania. I heard people, it's a taxi ride, you hear someone make a comment, and you think, so this is the other problem about the history, the legislation. It embeds and underpins the attitudes and the beliefs of people who don't really know or close to the story. And that's one of the terrible things. Now, get back to the substance of what you were saying.
It's all related. It's all related. It's intersectional, isn't it?
Well, that's the point that we come from, is that everything is connected.
It's all
for
connected.
us. It's circular, and you can't have one without the other, and so we can't be healthy. But I'm pleased to hear the comments about the bail laws, and I like the idea of people like yourselves being vigilant in this space, because that's, of course, something that I think whole of society should be up in arms about. Things like strip searching, things like even the need to be able to afford a phone call for some of our women is an issue. So there's some basic things.
You'd be pleased to know that's a key part of the platform, that these things need to change.
So, and the whole concept of self-determination in being part of trying to help with the solution for our people is a big issue. And we hope URUK recommendations will help that, and the awareness created out of our very short time in communicating with everybody that we are communicating with in the system, and I'm talking about the politicians and the police. And I have to say that's a kind of a mixed bag, the experience of having those people before us. But I was struck by the Commissioner of Police actually saying at the table on the record that he was surprised by some of the things he learned in his preparation for the hearing. And I thought, well, he's read something. Thank God for that. That was my first thought. But the second thing is myself and the Victorian Traditional Owners decided that we would give an item to the Commissioner of Police to go into where the training happens, that will have a story. We haven't finished the story yet. It'll be finished as we finish up. But we gave it not as a gift, but as a message to say, our people are always here when you are doing your training. This is to remind you to include training about our people and where they are and what the issues are. So that's a bit of a digression, but
It's important.
But it is important, and in that case, for that man to say what he did on the record, it was interesting, to say the least. And I have to say, the other thing I might mention, because of who you all are, is we had difficulty getting the government to the table in time for our calendar, and we had the notices to produce out. It delayed our work by 1 month, which was critical at the time that it was. But each of those people came back to the table, and they had reworked acknowledgement of country and most of them read a longer one than they would have normally done because of what we'd done and the publicity we got in calling them to account publicly. It was the highest point of our press coverage when we did that. So we oh, that's it. And so the story just goes on, and this is the sad thing. I mean, there'll be others sitting talking about these things, and this is why we are so stressed and
Burden of it,
it's
isn't
a
it?
burden that we carry, and it goes on. And I think education is important, and involvement of our people has to be part of the solution. But I think, it's a sad thing that, women wear the burden of most things in society, don't they, in a way? And I'm smiling as I say this, but it's almost universal in a way. So we do need society to change for the better. And, this country is very, very blokey. I mean, to this day, it's still blokey,
Professor Burke, that's a lovely space to end the formal questions, but I think that point about this country needing to change, I think there's people in this room who believe that and work towards that every day, and they do that with a heart to listen. So thank you so much for sharing the perspectives today. I also especially want to thank Nina and Leanne for their experiences that they've shared as well, and our other panellists as well, Fiona, Tanya and Ellie. I think we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Is there anyone who's got a burning question? Karen. Of course Karen has a burning question.
I'm Karen from Flat Out. I just wanted to acknowledge Nina and Leanne from the Network of Formerly Incarcerated Women and say that I think the solution is probably there in terms of what we do next. Let's get myself together for a second. Yeah, I mean, look, the evidence shows that since family violence, Royal Commission of Family Violence has increased funding to police and prisons, that the number of women in prison has gone up, and that's been compounded by the changes to the bail laws and by some complexities in the drug market, and particularly around ICE, but especially the family violence reforms, which, the ones that were related to criminalised women were actually physically to corrections and police. Now just think about that for a sec. I'm from Flat Out. We have 2.6 caseworkers. We've had 2.6 caseworkers funded by housing and homelessness for 35 years. And these are the kind of people that are working with us, thank goodness, for virtually no money. And then literally in the case of the network that Leanne and Nina are a part of, no money. They're all running on nothing. And yet we're funding, to address family violence, we're putting more funding into police and prisons. I'll just talk about the last one that's on my mind. Friday afternoon, one of our caseworkers took a trans woman who was escaping violence in her own flat to the police to get help to get the violent partner out of the flat. They said, wait there. The worker and the woman sat on the seats in the police waiting room. They sat there for 20 minutes and police from another police station arrived with handcuffs and arrested her, the woman, for some prescriptions that hadn't been picked up in the last prescription fraud that she was, she had AOD issues. There was, she'd been serving time for heaps and heaps of AOD related prescription matters. A couple of them had been missed out. They had them saved up. They came and arrested her and handcuffed her and took her off to prison. And the bloke, the perpetrator, stayed in the flat. And now she's waiting for a bail hearing. That's just every day, every week that's happening. And why are we putting more money into that? Why aren't we putting more money into the Ninas and Leannes who know what it's like and are not going to get the police, not going to get you put in handcuffs and your kids removed? So that you can actually go to them and get something sorted out, because at the moment you cannot go to the police station if the risk is you're going to be put in handcuffs and taken off to jail. You can't go. So we've got to have an option that's not that. I wanted to also say some good news. We've got around 300 odd women in the prison system in Victoria at the moment. That is 50% down on what it was in 2019. And I just wanted to say, amazing, Fiona, Europe, Smart Justice for Women, Law and Advocacy Centre for Women, Fitzroy Legal Service, we've got Monique, Human Rights Legal Service. We have made progress. We have made some progress. Congratulations.
Easy for the thank you. I'm going to pass back now to Sarah, who's our coach.
Thank you so much. Is that on? Yes. Wow, thank you. What an amazing, insightful and fruitful discussion. It's been such an honour to hear from all of you today. And yeah, Karen, those comments were so on point. Thank you for finishing us off with that. Yeah. We do have some small gifts for our speakers. So Ellie will hand those out now, but who is also a speaker herself, so thank you, Ellie. Professor Burke, Leanne, Nina, Tanya, Fiona, thank you so much. It's been great having you here and hearing from you today. These gifts have been purchased from Global Sisters. They're a not-for-profit marketplace for women-led micro-business. So the chocolate is from Chocolate on Purpose, which is 100% Aboriginal woman-owned. And there's a little soap in there that's from a place called Mighty Impression, also purchased through Global Sisters. So Global Sisters have seen women go off welfare, been able to work for their businesses full-time, and even employ other women in their business. Incredible things happen when we back women. So that wraps us up for today. A feedback survey will be circulated to attendees next week. It'd be great if you could fill that out and let us know how you thought today went. A recording and a copy of the platform will also be sent around. In the meantime, you can visit the Federation's website and just select the Smart Justice page. We invite you to stay for tea and coffee and further discussion. Let's keep the momentum going on this. As Nina said, this is a big coalition. We have a big number of members and also leading experts in the field. We have some power in that, and let's use it to agitate for change and using our platform to move forward. There will be some photos. So if you did want a photo in front of the Smart Justice banner, it'd be great if you could come to the front and just let Katie know that you would like a photo. We'll bring it forward so it's more accessible. If you have any questions about the coalition, just come and have a chat to either myself or Ellie. And that concludes today.